Hey everybody, it's Helen Hillix, licensed therapist, intuitive counselor, and I'm here today to talk about anxiety and how to handle anxiety. And it's so prevalent, and part of the reason I'm talking about it is because I am challenged with anxiety, and the older I get, the more I realize for how long I've been managing anxiety. And I am taking it more and more seriously because it's a plague and I don't want to have to deal with it constantly anymore. So I want to get better and better at it. So when I want to do that, I talk to you about it and organize my thoughts and, look things up and support myself as well as I'm hoping that it supports you. And, I think everybody knows what anxiety is, because everybody has anxiety at times. If you're late for an appointment, even if you're not an anxious person, even if anxiety is not your default way of handling things, everybody has it sometimes. So, I grew up with a depressed mother, but I don't tend to be depressed. I think, my reaction to her depression was anxiety. So I want to talk about, I looked up the word anxiety just to see what the dictionary would say, and I came across this that really touched me. David Barlow defines anxiety as a future-oriented mood state in which one is not ready or prepared to attempt to cope with upcoming negative events. And I'm going to say that again, a future-oriented mood state in which one is not ready or prepared to attempt to cope with upcoming negative events. And that's the distinction that he makes between future and present dangers, which divides anxiety and fear. Fear is something that's happening now. Anxiety is something about the future. So that really spoke to me, I think, because I believe that it gets to the root of my anxiety is that I didn't feel prepared to deal with possible upcoming negative events. If you look back in your history, I think you can probably find your anxiety started in your childhood too. Again, if you're someone that deals with a lot of anxiety, I'm not talking about just transient, appropriate anxiety of the moment, whatever appropriate means. I just mean that it's not something that you really struggle with. But for those of us who really struggle with anxiety, I think if you look back in your childhood, you will often see that your anxiety began because of chaotic things or unreliable things or unpredictable things that happened in your childhood that made you feel like, it was on you. You had to manage yourself. You had to take care of yourself and maybe other kids too. And that you did not feel safe. And so, and when you're a child and you're trying to manage things and feel like you have to be grown up and make decisions and so forth, that triggers this feeling of not being prepared. And so that you're not prepared so you don't feel relaxed because you're not prepared. I mean, when you're a kid and you feel in an unsafe situation, it is actually realistic for you to know that you're not prepared. The unfortunate thing is, the default doesn't then become, let me find someone else who is prepared, some other adult who can provide me a sense of safety and who is prepared to handle the unknowable, unavoidable future negative outcomes. Somebody else that can handle that because I know I'm not prepared. That's not what we do. We tend to think I have to do it. So you grow up, and no matter whether you're 7 or 70, you grow up and you feel still unprepared. You bring that feeling with you that you don't know how to handle these unpredictable negative events in the future. And you know what? When has this been more prevalent than right now with the worldwide pandemic? Everybody feels anxious and nobody can tell you what is coming in the future. And it's easy for me to tap into that collective anxiety about the fact that nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. Is anyone going to be able to afford coaching? Is the economy going to completely collapse? Are people going to be starving? I mean, there are so many questions. Is it ever going to end? Are we ever going to get back to normal? So I want to just allow for the reality of the world that there is fear because things are happening right now. I had 2 clients yesterday, both of whom have COVID-19, and so do their partners. And these are young, healthy people. One of them thinks she got it at a restaurant, and the other one thinks she got it at a gym. So they are closing those things back down, and that's probably a good thing. Anyway, there is current fear. They're scared for themselves. That's not anxiety, that's fear. That's happening to them right now. But the anxiety is more based on, okay, what's going to happen to me in the future? Am I going to get well? And so on and so forth. So I want to acknowledge the reality of the situation that all of us find ourselves in right now. And I also want to make the comment that this pandemic exacerbates our already existing ways of coping with reality, but it doesn't create it on its own. I've already been struggling with anxiety. And it's interesting because things like a worldwide pandemic, I actually have a more circumspect view of. I can actually tap into my spiritual strength better about things that are happening in the world than I can about myself. If I could when I have anxiety, it's will my daughter who has compromised lungs, will she die of COVID if she gets it? So it's a very trying time, and it's not the only time in our lives when we feel anxiety. So what do we do about anxiety? I have a couple of really, really simple tools that you may or may not already use, but I want to talk about the 5-step process. The first one is, of course, the awareness that you're anxious. I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with over the years, and myself included. I was a grown-up person before, and I don't even remember how old I was, but I was, maybe in my 30s before I realized how anxious I am. I didn't think so. I just wasn't aware of it. So the first step, of course, in any issue in the resolution of it is to notice it, to ask for feedback, ask people around you, do you see me as an anxious person? And you might be surprised. You absolutely might be surprised. I was working with a client yesterday, who was saying it's hard for him to recognize his anxiety, but he is incredibly anxious. He distracts himself with lots and lots of activities, which I have done myself, but he is incredibly anxious. And yet awareness is the first step for him, noticing that his body's tight, that his stomach is churning, that his respiration is increased or his heart rate is increased. For me, it's noticing my body tightness and noticing the unpleasant agitation in my mind, the worry, the nervousness. For me, it's all about feeling nervous. So being aware is the first and incredibly important step. And the second one is to bring your intention to the issue. My intention is to develop, I started to say resolve, but I don't know that I'm ever going to resolve my anxiety. I mean, I feel like it's an inherited trait. I'm saying this because my grandmother, I remember driving with my grandmother to the grocery store when she was, in her 80s. And she was in the passenger seat, and literally every 15 or 20 seconds, she would check the gas gauge. And I asked her, what are you doing? I'm just checking to make sure we have enough gas. And it's like, I kept reassuring her, Grandma, it's only like 3 blocks down the road. We have tons of gas. but she couldn't help herself. She was so anxious. So I feel like it's like wired into my brain, but I can absolutely learn to intervene with it more effectively. And I am dedicated to it. So bring your intention to being dedicated to realizing how important handling your anxiety is. Because when in stress, we regress. Absolutely a fact. When in stress, we regress. When you're anxious, you don't think clearly. When you're anxious, you do impulsive things to try to make yourself feel better. I know that my anxiety, and I'm not the only one, anxiety is tremendously correlated with overeating. And, that's another thing I'm taking on right now is I've stopped overeating. And of course, my anxiety is higher because I've stopped overeating. And so, but I'm dedicated to taking them both on. And so anxiety does not serve any functional purpose. So we get to intend and to realize that this is probably one of the most important commitments you'll ever make to yourself, is to take on your anxiety, because it interrupts your healthy eating. It gets in the way of relationship. It inhibits your sexuality, or it might reinforce it. You might be compulsively masturbating or looking at pornography or whatever to deal with your anxiety. So it can lead to all kinds of dysfunctional and disruptive behaviors. So intending to really take it on as a priority in your life. So many people discount it as, oh, it's all right. I'm anxious, yeah, but I function just fine. But if you really struggle with anxiety like I do, it does interfere in your life. And another client I was working with, we ended our session saying, taking on his anxiety is the most important priority in his entire life right now. He's a lawyer, he's got a family, lots of other wonderful things are going on in his life. But his relationship with himself and with life and with his wife and his kids and everything else is so colored by anxiety. So intend to take this on as if it were the most important priority in your life, because I believe it is. Okay, now to the really practical parts of it is when you are aware that you're anxious and you want to take it on and you notice it in the moment, stop and breathe for 1 minute. Just take in deep breaths and be conscious of taking in slow, deep breaths. And you will be amazed at how quickly the anxiety begins to dissipate just by focusing on breathing. And sometimes it might take you more than 1 minute. But if you count your breaths and just focus on breathing and managing your thoughts in terms of giving your mind something else to focus on, which is your breathing, then whatever you're anxious about recedes and the breathing becomes the prominent focus. And as you breathe, your body relaxes. As you breathe, your mind calms down. As you breathe, your heart rate and your breathing relaxes. So that is an incredibly important, powerful, and simple tool. And the fourth one is to develop a mantra for yourself. The fourth step is to develop a mantra for yourself. I remember at a particularly panicky anxiety time in my life a few years ago, I literally had to say to myself, I am not going to let anxiety rob me of the present moment. And that, even as I say it right now, helps me so much. I'm not going to let anxiety rob me of the present moment. And you know what that does for me is that it reminds me that anxiety is not me. I am not helpless over my anxiety. Anxiety is an energy, and I have the ability to put my energy somewhere else, i.e., the present moment. And I say to myself over and over, I am not going to let anxiety rob me of the present moment. And then I may say to myself, all is well in this moment, or nothing bad is happening in this moment. And if it happens, and of course I know you've seen probably Facebook memes or Instagram or wherever the quote about 99% of what you are worried about or anxious about is never going to come to pass anyway. And so I tell myself, all is well now, or there's nothing bad happening in this moment. And if it happens in the future, I'll manage it then. So I have an inner dialogue, but it starts with, I'm not going to let anxiety rob me of this present moment. And I think that is such a powerful mantra for me. Again, you can make up your own, but if that works, please use it. And then the fifth step in this, anxiety tool is to develop your skills in facing reality. And that is a very, very big step that we actually will be continuing to evolve our entire lives. We'll be continuing to learn and grow in our ability to handle reality our entire lives. But let me give you some ideas about that. If you have financial concerns, take a look at your budget, make a budget, look at your checkbook, face your credit score, make a plan, deal with that financial anxiety. If you need to get a second job, right now, of course, with the pandemic, I don't know whether that'll be possible, but take it on, face it, make a plan for yourself. Again, going back to David Barlow's definition about anxiety is a future-oriented mood state in which one is not ready or prepared to attempt to cope with upcoming negative events. That upcoming negative event might be you run out of money, you can't pay your bills, you're going bankrupt. Whatever it is, prepare yourself to deal with the reality of the situation when it comes. If someone is sick or dying, get support so that you can get spiritual support as well as emotional support and physical support. It's not some amorphous, unknowable thing. Reality isn't. Reality is whatever happens. So if you know that you are anxious about losing your home if the pandemic continues, do the best you can to stay in the present moment, and at the same time, develop the skills and face the reality that if that happens, here's my plan. I will buy a used RV and park it in my friend's huge yard. I will move in with my sister. I will go to a homeless shelter. Whatever the plan is, I will contact my sister and find out if worse comes to worse, can I live with her or my parents, or, there is always some kind of plan. I will live in my car, and then pare down your belongings. It's like I started to say nothing is a tragedy. This is the mentality that people with anxiety carry, is that everything's a tragedy. And if you really connect to the oneness, to the spirituality, to the reality that life is about evolution, it's not about controlling reality, it's about evolution. And in that paradigm, nothing is a tragedy. Even if I die, it's not a tragedy. It's reality. It's something that is inevitably going to happen, of course. And rather than worrying about it, I say, I'm alive in this moment, and I'm not going to let anxiety rob me of this present moment. And if I don't want to die, I need to take on my food addiction. I need to exercise every day. I need to meditate. I need to eat clean and healthy. And so, I can prepare myself that when I do die, I'm not in self-recrimination. I can prepare my spiritual connection so that when it comes my time to die, I will feel more prepared for that. I will feel more ready for that transition. So there's always some positive action that you can take to help yourself feel more prepared. If you know that you are emotionally weak in certain areas of reactivity, let's say, then get some support around that. Practice that. I have a podcast about reactivity. So listen to people offer you support about the things that you know are weak in your personality or your emotional makeup. Strengthen yourself spiritually, strengthen yourself physically. And all of that, why do I mention that in terms of anxiety? Because it's so much about feeling prepared to handle the reality. My daughter is a recovering heroin addict. She's sober over 3 years now. And when she was actively using, I knew every single day that she could die. And it's interesting. I, of course, felt anxiety about that in some ways, but not as much as you would think, because that is one thing I knew I had prepared myself as best I could to handle. I knew that I had a support system. I knew that I was spiritually aligned with the idea that she had a destiny over which I have no control. So I can cry about that still, because of course it's still possible she could die. But I felt more peaceful about it because I actually took on preparing myself as best one can. And this isn't to say that I wouldn't be devastated if it happened in the moment, but I don't experience a tremendous amount of anxiety about it, even when she was using, because I felt I had prepared as best I could. So this is a commentary not only on giving you a way to handle it in the moment, but also in strengthening yourself so that you feel you actually are dealing with life's challenges in a healthier and healthier way. And that diminishes your anxiety in itself. So I hope this has been helpful. I love you. I always love hearing from you. If there are topics you want me to talk about, please let me know. And I will talk to you next week.